Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes, and today I will be talking about philosophy of mind and action with Dr. Helen Steward. Just to give you a quick introduction to her, she's a professor of philosophy of mind and action at the University of Leeds in the UK. Her research focuses on philosophy of action, free will, philosophy of mind and metaphysics. In February 2015, she was awarded a Research Leadership Fellowship by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. She is an associate editor for the journal Philosophical Explorations, and she is also the author of books like The Ontology of Mind and A Metaphysics for Freedom. So, Dr. Stewart, thank you a lot for coming on the show.
You're very welcome. Nice to be here.
Oh, it's completely my pleasure. Okay, so let me see. I already had some discussions about philosophy of mind with other people. But one thing that I found very interesting the first time that I got in touch with philosophy of action is that I never thought that to talk about agency and free will and all of these things, it would be so important for us to have a clear picture of what an action is and what is behind the causation, let's say, of an action. So why is it so important for us to have a clear picture about how we produce actions and what is causally behind those actions in order for us to study agency and free will, for example?
Okay, well, I think what's important about the topic of agency is that it's actually much more difficult than one might think to understand how we can have it at all. If we don't have it, we are not the sorts of beings we really think we are. We need a whole different conception of ourselves. If we do have it, though, we've got to understand how it's possible to have it. And that's what my work has really been all about, trying to make a place for agency within a picture of the universe that I think many of us sort of unreflectively accept, within which it's actually really difficult to make a place for agency. So if you think, for example, of the universe as something in which causation holds sway, where natural laws operate, where big things work as they do because of the nature of the interactions between the small things they're made of. If you have a view of the universe like that, it's very difficult to understand how there can be things within it that anything could be up to. Everything seems to sort of trace back and back and back causally to the way things were before, the way things were before that, the way things were before that, and the general laws and principles that govern the universe. And neither of those things are up to us. The past isn't up to us, the laws aren't up to us, so how can anything be up to us? And yet, in the concept of agency, it seems to me we have enshrined the idea that quite a lot of things actually are up to us. So my work is really all about trying to understand, well, whether that's possible, and if so, how is it possible? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And about the concept of causation, because I think it is very important for us to understand how causation works and what is a cause of something else in this case. Because just to give an example that I think most of the audience will be familiar with. When we talk about, for example, the results scientists, neuroscientists in this case, obtain when they put people under experiments where they use a functional MRI, and then they say something like, oh, because we detected this sort of activity in this specific area of the brain just some milliseconds before the person produced the action, then this activity is the cause behind that action. But is it really so? Is it really the cause, or is it just an element in the chain of causation, let's say, that perhaps is initiated elsewhere? How should we look at it?
Well, I think there are two kinds of problem involved in trying to sort of pin down what you might call the neural correlates of agency itself and of its causes in the brain. And one kind of problem is just empirical, really. I mean, it's the kind of empirical problems that you get when you're trying to deal with something which is extremely complex and tracing causal chains and causal pathways through something as complicated as the brain and containing as many different causal connections as the brain. It's just a tremendously difficult sort of thing to do. So there are the sort of general empirical issues that you get anyway. You're trying to deal with complicated causal systems and tracing causal pathways through them. But I think maybe what you're sort of hinting at a bit is that there might be other sorts of problems which are more kind of in principle problems when we're looking at the correlates of mentality, if you like. If we're looking to try to, say, for example, find decisions or intentions or desires or things like that in the brain, is that even a sort of conceptually sensible thing to be trying to do? I mean, I'm inclined to think the answer to that is really no. That we have this framework for thinking about our own actions in terms of, the desires to produce certain sorts of ends, intentions to produce certain sorts of ends, decisions we make, choices, and so on. That's the framework we use for thinking about the sort of causation of action or of agency, equivalently. But that framework, I think, can only ever have a sort of very rough and ready and loose relationship to its neurological underpinnings. I'm absolutely not saying it has nothing to do with neurological underpinnings. I'm not a kind of crazy dualist or anything. Clearly, somehow or other, when we move around, as we do in the world, there's a neurological story to be told. But whether that means we can just sort of take the items that we talk about in the usual psychological story, the intentions and the desires and the decisions, and say, oh, well, that's there and that's there and that's there, and and we can see it all happening on the fMRI. It's not going to be like that. It's not going to be like that. There aren't going to be nice, neat and tidy ways of linking things up in that kind of way. It's just not going to be. Well, my belief is it's not going to be conceptually possible. It's not a sensible way to imagine that the investigations might proceed. It's not a sensible task to find decisions in the brain. We can find, if you like, things that are going on in the brain that have something to do with what's going on when we're making decisions, but we won't be able to say, there's the decision, there's the end of deliberation, there's the start of decision, there's the beginning of the action. No. Silly idea to think we could do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in the production of an action, we need several elements, usually at least. We need usually an agent, we need an action, and we need some sort of intermediary of some kind between the agent and the action, the actual performance of the action, right? So what would you say is the relationship in this case between agency, the causation or the performance of a certain behavior, and free will?
Okay, so this is important, and it's hard to get right. I think of agency as the power to act. Agency is the power to act. But it isn't the same thing as causing actions. And a lot of people think that to act is to cause an action. That can't be the right way to think about it. If you think about what you've said, if agency is causing actions, how do we go about causing actions then? The natural thing to think is, well, the way we usually bring things about is to act. So does that mean that when we cause our actions, we have to act in order to cause our actions? And you can see that you're off on a regress. So we mustn't say we cause our actions. Lots of philosophers do say we cause our actions, but to my mind, you know, that way madness lies, that can't be the right story. We don't cause them. We just act. And in acting, we cause other things. So, you know, for example, I can cause my arm to go up, I can cause my leg to kick out, you know, I can cause my tongue and lips to make certain movements which mean that I am now speaking to you, and so on. And in doing those things, I'm acting. I'm causing things, but I don't cause the causing, if you see what I mean. Acting, in my view, is a sort of special variety of causing. Is how I would put it, a kind that only animate agents can do. You also mentioned free will, which is a term I've avoided a bit in my work because I think it brings in all sorts of connotations that I find unhelpful when thinking about the sorts of questions I want to ask about agency. So I tend to use this word agency. I think it's weird, for example, to say that animals might have free will. I think that's a strange thing. People think that sounds strange. It does sound strange, because the concept of free will has been traditionally and historically connected with some very, you know, human things, with moral responsibility for a start, and with the idea of, you know, choosing your fate, and deciding on moral principles and things like this, which of course it's silly to think that any animal, or any more simple animal than a human being, probably does very much of at all. So if you're using the term free will to set things up from the start, I think you get sucked immediately into very human-centered ways of thinking about the issues. Whereas what I think is that the very basic first line kind of problems about free will arise for something much simpler than free will thus described. They arise for the higher animals, for example. We think things are up to the higher animals too, at least within limits. You know, obviously there's such a thing as instinct. Animals are more governed by it than most human beings are. Of course, human beings are animals, I should say that. I mean, when I use the word animals, I'm meaning, of course, non-human animals. Going back to instinct, I don't mean, of course, to deny that, you know, things like instinct are important in animal behaviour, and indeed in our behaviour too. You know, we're not free of instinctual influences at all. But within limits, I think, the higher animals, particularly if you think about things like, you know, horses and dogs and gorillas, elephants, animals that we know really have some very complicated cognitive capacities, I think they choose within limits what they're going to do. You know, whether they're going to walk over here next or over there next. Will they pick up this toy or that toy? You know, are they going to swim this way, that way? Are they going to kind of have a bit of a rest for a few minutes? You know, I think there are choices within those sorts of animal lives that it's up to those animals to make. How that's possible is just the same question as how it's possible for us to have things be up to us. Of course, many more things are up to us and can be up to simpler animals, but it's the same, basically it's the same question. So I like to think about agency as an animal capacity, a capacity that belongs to many creatures that aren't human creatures. And I think that's helpful. I think that gives us a helpful kind of evolutionary framework in terms of which to think. I think it helps to separate out what I think are basically separate issues about moral responsibility. I mean, of course, when I say separate, I don't mean they've got nothing to do with one another. I do think agency is a necessary condition of moral responsibility. Yes. But that's it, you know, that's it. we need to be agents in order to be morally responsible. But I think one can get snarled up in all kinds of pseudo problems if one isn't quite careful to say there's a problem that arises for much simpler agents than us. That's at the very, very heart of the traditional free will problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but just before, I'm a bit afraid that perhaps people who are not knowledgeable about the literature on philosophy of action, just to make it a bit clearer for people, would you say that perhaps a good definition of what you understand to be an agent would be something like an agent is an organism or an entity that has the power to produce a certain action, even though just the fact that it wants to perform that action doesn't necessarily is the cause behind the action.
Okay, so what I would say is that an agent is a creature with the power to act, as I would put it. What's the power to act? Well, for me, that is connected with the capacity to have done otherwise, as philosophers put it often. So the idea is that if you're an agent and you act, you do something which you needn't have done. You needn't have done it, or you needn't have done it quite in that way, quite at that time, quite at that speed, whatever it is. That there's something about the way in which the world goes as a result of what you do that was up to you, that was in your power to make it go differently had you wanted to, or just had you made it go differently. It doesn't even require a different desire. There are just things in the world such that the agent has the power to enact them one way or another way. So there must be, as it were, kind of different possibilities in play when agency is in play. Otherwise, it seems to me, we lose the sense of the things being truly up to something which is an agent. Otherwise, you're off on a path where, you've got the causes and the causes of the causes and the causes of the causes of the causes. And you're thinking about the world in a very different kind of way from the way in which you're thinking about it when you're saying that certain things are up to agents. If certain things are up to agents, it has to be the case that things depend on agents, that they therefore could have done things they didn't do, or might not have done things they did do. The connection between the concept of an agent and this idea of alternate possibility is tight, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so another thing that I would like for you to talk about is that last year you published this paper that I read that I found very interesting, Action as Downward Causation, where you argue, at least I think this is what you argue about, that we can better understand free will by thinking about the hierarchical structure and systems of functioning of biological systems. So could you explain how that would be the case?
Yeah, so the idea is that one of the very big problems that we face in trying to think about how agency is possible is trying to understand how we can fail to be, or how our actions can fail to be, utterly determined by things which happen in our parts, roughly speaking. So one very natural way to think about action is like this. You think, well, an action's basically a bodily movement. What causes bodily movements? Well, it's stuff going on in our nervous systems, ultimately in our brains. What sorts of stuff is going on in our brains? Well, there are neurons firing, there are electrical interactions, there are chemical interactions, there's lots of this low-level, relatively small stuff happening. And that kind of, the nuts and the bolts, kind of the cogs turn, the action comes out. Now that's a model of action which is very, very problematic. I think you'll be able to see, and your viewers will be able to see, if you're trying to make room for true agency, for true free will in the world, if everything is just kind of traceable to activity in our parts in that way, and the activity in the parts is traceable to yet more activity in the parts, or to external influences of certain sort, you can see there's no locus there for, you know, for free will, for agency, for a real input, as it were, from a person or an animal. So I started to think about, well, how else can we think about what animals are in such a way that it might be possible to make that locus appear? And what I have come to think is that we need to understand what I call top-down causation. So the idea that, as well as, obviously there is bottom-up causation. We are affected by things that go on in our parts, of course. Of course there is an awful lot of bottom-up causation in the world. But as well as that, and particularly I think in biological systems, I think biology is the key to a lot of this. Biological systems are special. And in biological systems, you get top-down varieties of causation as well. So it can matter, for example, you know, to what goes on in a cell, what organ it's embedded in and what's going on in the organ more generally. It can matter what's going on in an organ. Sorry, it can matter to what's going on in an organ, what's going on in the system of which the organ's a part. You know, if it's the cardiac system, it can matter to what's going on in the heart. You know, what's going on in the system as a whole. And so my thought was, you know, keep applying that model logically. Can we say it can matter to what's going on in the parts of an animal, including an animal's brain? What's going on, as it were, in the animal as a whole? Is there a way of understanding action as the way in which whole animals come to impact on their parts? That, it seemed to me, was the most hopeful direction in which to go in order to make proper space for there to be true agency in the world. We have to be able to understand, make space for something like top-down causation. Of course, some philosophers have argued top-down causation is incoherent, it's impossible, and so on. But there are quite a lot of philosophers who, particularly philosophers of biology, actually, I think it's when you start to think about biology that the need for top-down causation and the viability of it starts to become apparent. And so there, you know, there's hopeful work being done, I think, on top-down causation. And that would be where I would put my money if someone were to ask me, you know, what's the solution to the problem of free will going to turn out to be? I think it's going to turn out to be top-down causation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's very interesting. And would you say then that perhaps for us to, in the future, have a full-fledged theory and understanding of free will, that we really have to understand agency in other animals apart from us, Homo sapiens, and even perhaps the functions that operate on them that could provide us with the operative basis for free will to arise?
I think the short answer is yes. You know, I think that would be a very good way forward. I mean, one of the, you know, the million-dollar questions for me is, how did agency evolve? How did it evolve? We have a world that didn't contain agency, presumably, at one point, or didn't contain what I would call agency. I have to be careful about that. Some people think that, you know, stones and the wind and the waves and so on can be called agents. I don't believe that. I think alternate possibilities of a quite robust sort have to be in play before you've got an agent. So the way I think of it, you know, the universe originally contains no agency. But then, just as life evolved from a universe that contained no life, so agency evolved from a universe that contained no agency. How? The question's just as hard in the case of agency, I think, as it is in the case of life. I don't know what the answer is. I wish I did. I don't think anyone knows what the answer is. But clearly, one very, very sensible starting point would be to think about agency in simpler organisms than us. You know, go trace agency down as far as you think it might go. Who knows quite where that is, but it might be, I've suggested, somewhere around something like spider level, insect level, somewhere around there. Our intuitions about agents start to give out, I think. But have a look at functioning of those sorts of creatures. How do they work? What kinds of choices can they make? How do they move? What sorts of systems do they seem to employ? One hypothesis that seems quite sensible to me is that agency evolves as creatures develop the need to hunt prey or to escape from predators. That begins to require a capacity to react in the moment in ways that can't be easily sort of programmable, because the world is very, very unpredictable. You don't know where the predator's going to come from, and you might need to be able to respond to more than one predator at a time, decide, you know, how to escape from both, make sure you don't run into the arms of one while running from another. You know, the world is complicated for predators and prey, and a very sort of fine-tuned discretionary capacity to do one thing rather than another on the spur of the moment might very well be the way, it seems to me, that evolution has decided to kind of solve the problem of how to create creatures that can hunt and can escape. So yes, I do think it's useful to look at simpler organisms and to think in evolutionary perspective about the issues that are involved. I think that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if we ever are to prove that other animals apart from us also have agency, that is, that they also are agents, that by itself would force us to put other animals on the same moral level as we put ourselves.
No, I don't think it would. I don't think that would follow. Something weaker might follow. I mean, for a start, animals, I think, aren't moral agents. It's not because they're not agents at all, but it's because they don't have the intellectual capacities and the sensibilities that you need to have to be a moral agent. So we can't expect them to, to follow moral rules. We can't expect them to have duties, and there are certain parts of morality that are absolutely centrally human things, and there's absolutely no way that animals are going to partake of the kingdom of morality so far as those parts are concerned. I'm firmly convinced. Are they moral patients in the sense that, do we need to take care of them? Do we need to look after them? Do we need to care about their pleasures and pains? Yes, of course we do. And I think the relevance of my work on agency and the work of others who insist that animals are agents and that's something that matters, where that can come in, I think, is in something like the following way. We tend to think, or have typically thought of, the way in which animals matter morally as a matter of we have to save them from pain. We have to make sure they're not in pain. We have to look after them in those ways. But if they're agents, I think we have to do more than that, because agents have lives. They have plans. They have things that they are set up so as to do. They are kind of teleological systems with a point and a purpose, and I wouldn't mind betting they care about those purposes. Particularly if we think about the higher animals again. If you think about a gorilla or an elephant or a dog, there are things they want to do. There are things they want to get done. They, as I put it before, they have lives, and I think we are therefore obliged not to interfere in those lives more than is minimally possible. So I think lots of our agricultural practices, for example, are morally obscene because they do involve treating animals in ways which don't respect the fact that they are agents, that they have lives, they have choices that they ought to be able to make. So though I wouldn't say thinking of animals as agents means that they have to be thought of as morally equivalent to us, I do think that certain of the ways in which we currently treat them would be made to look extremely morally dubious from a point of view in which we accept that animals are agents, as I do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I guess that this issue of free will is not as straightforward as it might seem at first sight, because, for example, if we in the future, through some scientific process, let's say, were to discover that there is no free will whatsoever, would that necessarily imply that our actions are absolutely determined and that a particular action would be inevitably performed?
Well, I suppose I would kind of doubt that that's the sort of thing one could find out. I suppose that one had no free will. Because, I mean, you can find things out empirically if they're sort of matters of fact. But whether a creature has free will or had free will on a particular occasion, if we treat that as equivalent to the question, could that creature have done otherwise? That's a question about possibility. It's not a question about actuality. So how do you answer that question? Could the creature have done otherwise? Well, we can't go back, can we, and sort of assess their powers from some God's eye point of view and see whether they did indeed have the power to do otherwise. We can just see what they did. The idea that they have the power to do otherwise is part of, as I see it, a big conceptual scheme, a way of thinking about the world that we operate with unthinkingly. I think we all pretty much automatically assume that we have lots of capacity to do otherwise all over the place, and actually that lots of higher animals do too. I think that's part of what one might think of as sort of folk psychology, if you like, or folk metaphysics. It's an assumption that's just sort of deeply ingrained in us. And so the way to tackle the question, you know, how do we find out whether a creature could have done otherwise? I think you have to look to the whole conceptual scheme. You have to say, well, could this whole conceptual scheme be wrong? Could the whole thing be wrong? And that's a very difficult question to answer. So I think what your sort of thought experiment is suggesting is that maybe science could come along one day and say, yep, the whole conceptual scheme, guys, it's wrong. Right? Nobody ever had the capacity to do otherwise. And maybe that's conceivable. Maybe that's conceivable. If that happened, I think what I would want to say is that I would then shift my position from the position that I have at the moment. I think I'd become a compatibilist at that point. I don't. Your viewers might not know what compatibilism is. Compatibilism, just to say very quickly, is the view that free will is compatible with lack of alternate possibilities, with complete determinism. I think if scientists were to tell me, there's no alternate possibilities in the world, guys, that's it, I think the rational response for someone whose starting point, as mine is the thought that, well, there is agency. I know that more deeply and centrally than I know anything. I'd give up the libertarianism. That's to say, I'd give up the view that free will's incompatible with determinism and say, oh, it must have been compatible after all then, if it's turned out that there aren't any alternate possibilities. Compatibilism turned out to be true, is the way I would go. I wouldn't infer that there's no agency at all. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you already talked about compatibilism. That was, in fact, my next question. But
Yes,
any,
I
any,
saw
any,
that. Preempted.
anyway, there's no problem about it. So now moving on to another topic. Would you say that then, and this is also again related to free will, what is the relationship between free will and moral responsibility? So, for example, going back to my thought experiment, let's say, would you say that if we were to discover that people completely lack free will, that would automatically imply that people also lack moral responsibility?
Well, I suppose my answer would be the same answer I just gave you, only applied to moral responsibility in a way rather than to free will. So I do think, as things stand, as the way the universe, if the universe is as I take it to be, I would want to say agency is a necessary condition of moral responsibility. If someone comes along and persuades me that actually there aren't any alternate possibilities after all, I think that's almost inconceivable, but suppose I accept it for the sake of argument. If someone manages to persuade me that there are no alternate possibilities at all, as I say, I think I'd have to, that would be so shattering to my way of thinking about things. I'd then, I think, retract my libertarianism. That's to say, I'd move to say, actually, it turned out agency was compatible with determinism after all. And I'd also be compatibilist about the moral responsibility part. So I'd say, so it turned out that moral responsibility didn't require alternate possibilities at all. Who knew? So that's kind of the route I would take. So I would want to preserve agency. I would want to preserve moral responsibility. I think it's more obvious that there is agency than that libertarianism is true. Libertarianism is a philosophical position with philosophical arguments behind it. You can make mistakes in philosophical arguments. You can think things are clear that are not. Plenty of people do think libertarians have made mistakes in their argument. But, the likelihood that libertarianism is false is, it's moderately high, even though I am a libertarian saying that. The likelihood that things are up to us is false, is minuscule. Of course things are up to us. I think that's so basic, it's impossible to imagine the world without that belief. I'm not saying everything's up to us. Certain things are up to us is non-negotiable for me. That's the starting point. Sometimes people think that's kind of weird and unphilosophical of me to say that, but I think people have double standards in philosophy. Take the problem of philosophical skepticism, the idea that we don't know that the external world exists. Now, most philosophers are totally content to accept that though we have no way of proving that the external world exists, it does, and that's a reasonable starting point for debate, that the external world does exist even though we can't prove it. I take what I think is a parallel line in the case of agency. Okay, I think it's a reasonable starting point for debate that agency exists, even though I think I would accept I can't prove it, because it will be a proof about something of which no proof is possible, a proof about possibility, a proof about a modal claim, essentially. So you can't prove things like that. Doesn't mean it's not a sensible starting point for debate. So that's how I see it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now the final question that I have for you, and keeping up again with my thought experiment, but now adding an element that I heard from Daniel Dennett in this case, that is, so let's say again that somewhere in the future scientists would discover that there is no free will. And so there are people, particularly in the neurosciences, that would have this knowledge. Would you say that it would be responsible for them to communicate this sort of knowledge to people from outside the sciences? Because, I mean, I think that we have a very strong intuition that if people were to know or to be informed that they didn't have free will, that they would feel at ease to do any kind of thing that went through their minds, because they would think that they didn't have any moral responsibility for their actions. And on the other hand, if that sort of knowledge was to be applied in the legal system, for example, and the notion of personal and moral responsibility were to be erased from the legal system, wouldn't that also eliminate strong deterrents of bad behavior?
Do you know what? I actually don't think it would make any difference. I actually don't think it would make any difference. I think well, perhaps that's too strong, that it wouldn't make any difference. I don't think it would make much difference. I mean, if you look now, there are people who believe that there is no free will. There are plenty of them, you know, who are hard determinists, respectable philosophers who think, you know, they've put forward the arguments, there's no free will. Nobody's morally responsible for anything they do. Do they, you know, cease to blame people who, you know, scrape keys along the side of their cars? Or no, of course not. They're human beings. They get angry. They blame people. They have emotions. We all have emotions. And the idea that this kind of, you know, the responsiveness that we have to one another, that's reflected in our what philosophers sometimes call the reactive attitudes. That's a phrase that P.F. Strawson introduced into the debate. You know, feelings of resentment, for example, feelings of gratitude, the positive ones. You know, person-directed feelings that have to do with how people treat you. Those aren't going to go. I just don't think those are going to go. They'll never go. As long as we're human beings, and as long as they're there, I don't think it will be possible for us to cease to think of ourselves as, in some sense or other, having moral responsibility. It's not. I think it's a kind of response to an intellectual idea that a human being could never have. It's too deeply rooted in us. It's too deep in our humanity, that responsiveness to others. So I think the scientists could say what they liked, and it would have little impact on our daily lives. I mean, the interesting question is whether it would have impact on our institutions, because within institutions you have pressures to conform to the scientific evidence in various ways that aren't there in individual interpersonal relationships. So it is an interesting question whether, if it were to turn out, you know, that there's no free will, as you put it, assuming that could be scientifically proved, as I've said, I very much doubt it could, but suppose it could. I think there would be such institutional pressures, as you know, there already are in parts of the legal system, you know, where it comes to be thought that a certain kind of behaviour is the product of a disease or a disability, or, you know, this kind of thing. We think we have to adapt. We do adapt. So maybe there would be institutional changes. I mean, this is futurology in a way. Who knows what the results would be? But I think there would be quite strict limits to what's emotionally possible for human beings to manage in response to an intellectual discovery, if indeed there could be such an intellectual discovery as that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's just hope that's the case, Dr. Stewart. And before we finish the interview, would you perhaps like to share with people some interesting piece of work you're doing at the moment and where they can follow your work on the internet?
Okay, so oh gosh, what is the most interesting thing to say that I'm doing at the moment? I've got a lot of different things on at the moment, but what I'm trying to think about at the moment is the concept of ability, um, which is connected with some of the things I've talked about today. To say that someone could have done otherwise is, in certain cases anyway, to say that they were able to do otherwise, that they had the ability to do otherwise. So I think the idea of ability is a very important one. The connection between the concept of ability and the word can and could. These are extremely difficult concepts to understand philosophically, and I want to understand them better than I do. So that's what I'm currently working on. That's what I'm currently trying to think about. I can't direct you to any work on it because I haven't got anything on. I haven't got anything published. It's brand new for me to think about this. So, but in general, I put my work on academia.edu. It's also on ResearchGate. It's on the Leeds University White Rose repository. So there's all kinds of ways in which one can follow it. So I'll put a draft of this paper up as soon as I got something that looks like it might be worth saying.
Mhm. Okay, very well, and I will be leaving links for all of your work in the description box to this video, and please, for people that will be watching this, go check it out because it's very interesting. And we didn't cover not even 10% of Dr. Stewart's work here in this conversation, so go check it out. And Dr. Stewart, it was a really interesting conversation, and I would really like to thank you again for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you for asking me to come on.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanche, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.